Yeah. I guess we can turn on my microphone. Are you hearing something? Yes? Bonsoir, Montréal. Good evening, Montréal. I'm just testing, exercising the impulse response of the audience here. Feels good to be here. Thank you very much, Vyacheslav, and thank you all for having invited me to something that I now understand what it is all about. I was really scared about being invited to a distinguished lecture. I now understand the meaning of those two words. I do the lecture, and you are the distinguished audience. Many things I'm going to talk tonight, and are probably very well known by you. There's something that may have disappeared under the strata of history, and that the visit of a customer of us and good friend named Gennady from Russia, from Mosfilm, showed me, said, this is something I need to share with you guys. This is dating back to 1956, and I was probably just a few months old at that time. That's IBM's probably first major attempt at recording on a hard drive, and the device you see here managed to hold a whopping 5 megabytes back then. And see the size of it. It's today a portable hard drive fits in your pocket and stores 1,000,000 times more data than this first hard drive. And it also costs considerably less today. Why am I starting with this? Because nothing of the recent audio or production could be possible if we didn't have had this major improvement in computer storage. And it's amazing to see that it took us about 60 years now to get from where we were there to a sugar size storage that is incredibly less expensive and weighs less. As a matter of fact, I did a bit of calculation. If we look at the reduction in volume or weight of storage, of hard drive storage between then and now, the total is a major 2.2 to the power of 33. And that means if we take about the 64 years, that is the time span between this and what we know today, it's about halving of the cost every 2 years. It's a pretty remarkable achievement of mankind, and it's maybe also why I wouldn't wanted to start a digital audio workstation company back then, since I can't believe that 30 seconds, it's barely 30 seconds of CD quality audio you could have recorded on that hard drive. With, of course, transfer rates. I don't know them exactly, and I don't know the access times of that drive, but you probably would have taken a week to listen to those 30 seconds. So no way to do it in real time back then. Let's move a bit forward to the 1990s. So we're going to do a little hop. That's actually the time when I started the emerging technologies, when I left NAGRA. And at that time, I remember going to California with great impatience to take delivery of a SCSI drive. It was the early days of SCSI drive, a Micropolis 500 megabyte. So barely just 100 times this size. But that would already allow to record something like 16 tracks of 24-bit digital audio, those were the times. And the transfer rate was pretty advanced for those drives at 10 megabytes per second, which would allow us to play those or record those 16 tracks. And I had, as a matter of fact, spent 10 years doing mostly analog at Nagra Kudeski, although the last couple of years I started working on what was to become the Nagra D, the first digital recorder. So essentially that meant I needed to retrain all I had learned in the analog world for the digital world. And here starts my venture in digital audio, basically, which I want to share a bit with you tonight. And I'll come back to magnetic tape recording at the end of my presentation again. So there is something that very early on I felt uneasy about digital audio, especially in those early days, and I wasn't certainly alone. It's the fact that it was taken for granted, since the human ear doesn't hear above 20 kilohertz roughly, and you need to be young for that. It was accepted that Nyquist frequency of a sampling mechanism to record digital audio would be fine, provided this Nyquist rate was about 20 kilohertz or just above it. And I didn't like that idea too much, because when we look at what's actually happening, to do digital audio, you need, of course, an anti-aliasing filter if you don't want the high frequency to fall down. And they are, fortunately, and for our good luck, higher frequencies than 20 kilohertz in the real world. Any instrumentist, any voice has harmonics that go way beyond 20 kilohertz, so you need to filter that. On the left, we have the perfect ideal anti-aliasing filter, and on the right, what we call a brickwall filter, and it's a challenging thing to implement. There's on the left part what we call the pass band, then a transition band, where we basically filter down from 0 dB down to something like 100 dB, and then the stop band. And when we look at this necessary requirement for recording digital audio and storing it, we see two things. Unfortunately, first, the human ear doesn't correspond to the ideal anti-alias filter on the left, first of all. And more importantly, real-world audio signals don't stop at 20 kilohertz. Music is a perfect example where we see that energy doesn't stop miraculously at 20 kilohertz. This is a good example of what can be seen on a spectrogram of a piece of music by Emilio Morales. And maybe in the audience you won't see that, but this is actually a spectrogram of an analog bounce, and there is some fog. There's a bit too much light. You don't see the analog fog in the, let's say, 20 to 40 kilohertz range there, but you clearly see also all the harmonics that extend largely to 40, 50 kilohertz in that example. And this piece of music was taken as an example by Toby Sayre, which is the president of the International Association of Sound and Audiovisual Archives, and he told me I was free to use it to show how that sounds. Doing the analog bounce like he did was revealing also some characteristics of the analog console, which used to be SSL 4000G, which shows a little bit this haze and fog in the upper frequency. I see people who know what I'm talking about. Let's just quickly listen. Maybe not the best environment to listen critically. Here, the same thing, he did a digital bounce, and now all this fog has gone. It's entirely disappeared because he simply copied digitally from his original content to another copy. What I will never understand is why philosophically it would be so important to be having a system that represents and wants to be as faithful as possible to the real world, that needs to have -0.1 or -0.001 dB at 19.5 kilohertz, say, and it would be perfectly all right to be at -107 dB, just 2 kilohertz above at 21.7 kilohertz or something like that. This goes beyond my understanding. Let's listen the digital bounce. Enough. And the next thing I want to quickly address, and that's basics, of course, for most of you, but I was asked not to go too technical either. It's fundamentally, we often look at frequency as the main key criterion. It needs to have a nice frequency response and equipment that is designed these days. But we more rarely look at the time domain. And we have a great guy, Jean-Baptiste Joseph Fourier, who a few centuries ago, I think it's 3.5, expressed something which is good to remember. It's if we look at the Fourier transform of what we were talking about earlier, which is this ideal filter, which is on the bottom right part here, and we translate into the time domain, we get a convolution by a so-called sinc function, which you can see on the left in the time domain here. What that essentially means, and as my teacher in the Institute of Technology would explain me con le mani, means anything that is very localized in one of the domain will be translated into a highly non-localized thing in the other domain. So the sharper the filter, the longer this sinc impulse will smear out in time. And that's a basic principle to me that conducted us quite early on deciding this may have an adverse effect because human hearing is extremely, due to evolutionary processes, trained into making information out of auditory clues and transients particularly that tell us where the prey is or where the predator, more importantly, where the predator is. And this is all based on time cues, very precise time cues. So, Another way of mentioning what happens is whenever you have a transient signal like this ideal square wave that goes through such a filter, the response in time will be an event that is affected by the so-called Gibbs phenomenon, which you see here. And it's sort of a pollutive halo of additional energy which wasn't there in the first place. Are we hearing that or not is one of the great debate, and I'm here a little bit to talk on the camp of those who say, yes, it's audible. But why is it audible? Because this thing that rings is like a pre-echo. At least when you have symmetric filters, you have as much energy happening earlier than the real event than after the event, and you see that clearly here. On top of that, this ringing energy has a fundamental, not exact frequency, but a range of frequency, because it's growing up slowly and then decaying, which is near the Nyquist frequency. That actually is in the upper range of our auditory system, at least for those of you who are young or kept their ears in good condition. So let's look at it on a real measurement we did. Creating 100 Hz perfect square wave in our system, then going through a D to A and A to D chain, and we're recording it back in the workstation. And you see clearly what happens on the time domain on such an ideal square wave. Remember, that's about 100 Hz. So every 100 times a second, or twice that frequency, you're going to have this little bit of additional energy produced, ringing around 18, 19, 20 kilohertz. And the duration of it is also quite considerable. Here, with the naked eye, you see that it's going to extend at least 25 samples, which is about half a millisecond. And audibly even longer, of course, but you see it. The phenomena here is noticeable with the naked eye. A little detail, you see it's asymmetric because the D2A I used on that day was a so-called asymmetric DA with shorter and less important pre-echo to the detriment of having a longer decay after, to which usually we consider the ear is a bit less sensitive. What we could find out, comparing on a spectrograph the original signal with all its harmonics going upwards of 50, 80 kilohertz, and the signal that underwent a DA and DA conversion at 48 kilohertz is what you see here. If we look closer view, if we take a closer view to the spectrogram, you have in time originally the ideal square wave. Then I moved to the filtered square wave. Now, one thing is immediately noticeable. All the higher frequency components are, of course, gone totally. But that's not the most intriguing part, because, as we all know, the human ear doesn't hear above 20 kilohertz. So assume that's fine. What you see, however, here, and that's the interesting thing that was revealed, is if you look in the area, let's say between 12 to 20 kilohertz, the part that underwent DA and AD is considerably brighter, which shows it has been polluted in a certain sense with absolutely audible artifacts from the filters. And remember, this was exercised with a 100 Hertz square wave. If we had used a 1000 Hertz square wave, which would have triggered this additional ringing 10 times more often in time, the difference would be even greater. And that's, remember, that's under 20 kilohertz, what we see here. Good. Let's move forward in the 2000s. So by the turn of the century, while we were slowly getting to grips with the fundamentals of proper analog to PCM and backwards PCM to analog conversion, and that repeated audition tests definitely proved that 24-bit 96 kilohertz was much better than early 16-bit 44.1 kilohertz, not only for acquisition, but also for reproduction. We thought, that's it. We're going to have an easy ride perfecting slowly maturing PCM technology. As it turns out, things didn't happen really in such a, we worked hard, let's now enjoy some relaxing times. Came 2001, and we became quite involved in developing the early equipment that would serve to produce content for the SACD, Super Audio CD, released by Philips and Sony. And I have to admit that it took a while to adapt to DSD. And its learning curve made us feel like a return to analog days. As a matter of fact, there's quite a few similarities between DSD and analog that I would tend to say that DSD classifies almost closer to analog than to digital PCM. Just to quick explanation for those for which DSD is not too much known. PCM is a way of sampling, of course, and quantizing samples in time at a moderate sampling rate. Above you have a 44.1 kilohertz example, but with pretty precise digital values, 16-bit or 24-bit these days, or even more. Whereas DSD is absolutely the contrary. It uses only 1 bit to reproduce the audio information. But it does so at a much higher bit rate, which is 2.8 megahertz. So, in short, the way it works, and incidentally, most of today's AD converters or DA converters work on this principle, at least in the audio part of business. We have a very simple mechanism at the heart of that, which is called a sigma-delta modulator, which is composed of a first part on the left, which is a summing device. In that case, a subtractor. Then a low-pass filter, which is a summer. And then a quantizer at the right part, which produces, in our case of 1 bit, just a 1 bit output, which is then returned to be subtracted to the next input. So it's pretty simple in mechanism. And the terminology, sigma delta, comes from the fact that there's a sigma part, the low pass filter here, and a delta part, which is the differentiator. So if we move to the next slide, it shows a real implementation of what one of those modulators is, as we used in our early equipment. It's a sequence of 5 integrators whose weighted outputs are then added and conveyed to comparator, whose output will actually just be the sine of all these of all these summed signal. So if the sign is plus, it outputs a +1. If the sign is negative of the product, it will return -1, and the DSD will just, as convenience, only output a bit, which is either 1 or 0, depending on that sign. And then it returns to the input. So it's the structure that is at the heart of DSD, with the following advantage, because DSD with only 1 bit is supposed to sound horribly bad. You know all the difference between 16-bit and 24-bit. We want more bits, it sounds better, etc. So why go the entirely opposite way, would you ask? Is only possible because we have this low-pass filter. And this low-pass filter does the following. It basically shapes all noise away from the audio band, as you can see here. So this is an example of the exact modulator I showed you, with a sinus near full scale at 3 kilohertz, and it works. Basically what you see is the noise, despite the fact it's only being represented with 1 bit, the noise has completely been removed away from the audio band, from typically up to 20 kilohertz, and you see it growing afterwards and become quite prominent above, of course. This achieves something like, it had to be better than CD, obviously. CD with 16-bit provided 96 dB of dynamic range, and here typically this provided the audio recording industry, and with something that allowed about 120 dB of dynamic range, so typically equivalent to a PCM system of 20-bit. The interesting part of DSD is not, of course, all this noise, which fortunately the human ear, again, doesn't hear, particularly as it is not even correlated to the signals in the audio band, but to the fact that since we have such a high frequency of sampling, 2.8 megahertz, the requirement for anti-aliasing filter becomes very gentle. So in the frequency domain, remember the Fourier transform, we now have a very gentle filter, which in turn turns into a very time-accurate response, which we can see here. Assume, it's an ideal representation, of course. Assume on the left we have a very short Dirac pulse of an analog signal, an ideal timpani or whatever, could be of similar quality. And you see, with gradually incrementing sampling rates in digital domain, what the actual response of that analog signal turns into. 48 kilohertz is pretty lousy. The energy is smeared over a long period of time. 96 kilohertz becomes quite better, still showing quite a bit of ringing artifacts because of the steepness of the filter that is still required. Then we have 192 kilohertz, almost there, and DSD to the right. I have to admit that in the real world, it's not quite as beautiful in the DSD domain because, of course, for practical reasons, most of playback equipment, CD players or SACD players, will introduce a gentle 50 kilohertz around low-pass filter to reduce this high frequency energy. So, we start our journey into DSD. What happens next is there's going to be an evolution of the techniques. Of course, one of the things that we already early saw in production systems is this noise is pretty close to the 20 kilohertz bandwidth, so Of course, when it became possible to create double DSD or DSD 128, this was very welcome, because every time you have increasing possibilities to download high-res music via the internet, and users were able to get recordings in double DSD format into their homes as well, and not limited to the original SACD format. So double DSD seemed to fix some of these problems we had with noise growing very early on, so it was an improvement. Then later on, technology allowed us to move even further. So you see the noise curve, the red one is DSD 64, the original DSD. Then the one in orange shows a large improvement with the noise floor only ramping from 40 kilohertz onwards. And then finally with DSD 256, I think we're quite elegantly there. That's the yellow curve that shows no major noise before about 80, 90 kilohertz. So that was a trend, and today you're gonna find that many home DAX engines will support those additional rates. The good thing also is that it seems to work for some of our customers, which are really the people to whom we listen quite a lot. I take an example. I just had a discussion at the AES New York last week with the Library of Congress person, which tell us that they are now archiving contents such as the Les Paul original tapes. They have 8-track, 24-track tapes of great value from the Les Paul collection. And they do that with what they think is the perfect medium to convey all the original qualities of the analog signals of those tapes. And this is DSD 256. So we observe this trend, and we're going to pursue, of course, refining this DSD process. But on the same side, I need now to tell about all the small negatives about DSD, and that's why I'm going to introduce you to what we call DXD, Digital Extreme Definition, which is a PCM format, which is the last curve. You see the green one here with a beautiful noise floor that is flat and extends way beyond 100 kilohertz, which is nothing else than PCM running at 352.8 kilohertz, which we had to do because there are a few tricky limitations in the DSD format, not as a consumer, but when you want to produce in that format, it's cumbersome. First of all, you can't mix, which is kind of annoying, I guess. And every time you mix, you apply a gain, a Tanna, whatever. You're going to multiply your 1-bit signal by a coefficient, which might be 0.923, and the result is not 1 bit, definitely not. So you're going to move to multi-bit anyhow, sooner or later. Among the other issues, it is quite complex to edit DSD, because as you saw, this fabric of delta modulators, they have history in their cells. It's integrators. So you can't just go from one stream of DSD to another one without complex additional processing, because both signals might have complete different history, and switching from one to the other will produce audible clicks. So you don't like clicks. There's enough unwanted ones to create wanted ones. Even metering is a hassle, because metering 1 bit, how do you know the level of all the signals below 20 kilohertz in your 1-bit signal? You won't find out. It's a constant, what you measure is constant high frequency noise. So you essentially need to filter by moving first to PCM and then filter to 20 kilohertz your signal, just to show you a view meter, a peak meter. Then, assume you managed to do all your processing, even an EQ potentially can be done. You therefore went to multi-bit. At one point in time, you need to requantize to 1 bit. Otherwise, it's no longer 1 bit. So after every process, a new 1-bit remodulation is required. And you don't want too many of those, because as I told you, DSD is a bit akin to analog. If you do too many copies, it degrades ultimately. Same phenomenon applies to DSD. So finally also, just one more point. I really wouldn't want to be the one coding a reverb or any complex algorithm in DSD. This could be quite a lifetime's achievement to do it. So, and probably it's still out of reach of today's computing power of desktop computers. So that called for another method, and the method we found out was DXD. So what's DXD? Essentially, it's a compromise. It's if we come back to this anti-aliasing filter, what we're looking after is something that would not degrade too much the qualities of DSD, which we have seen is this beautiful, stunning time response. So not muddling it too much, and still within affordability of processing power of desktop computers. That was 20 years ago, and still the case today, within reach of a mix engine running on a desktop computer. So you can compare here quite easily what I meant with steep brickwall filters, as you can see, for 48 kilohertz. This is, by the way, excerpts from the very AD chip we're using in some of our equipment. So you see its frequency curve at 48 kilohertz. So you basically move from at 21.5 kilohertz, 0 dB, down to minus 90 dB at 27 kilohertz. So what you see is the pass band, the transition band, and the stop band here. And look at what we see on DXD or 384 kilohertz filters. The pass band from 0 to, let's say, 100 kilohertz, beautifully flat. Then we have a considerable time and transition band, which is actually even larger in frequency than the pass band. So we go from 100 kilohertz all the way almost up to 300 kilohertz. So our pass band is 100 kilohertz, our transition band is 200 kilohertz, almost a double of it before we reach the pass band. And we feel that that's one of the key criteria that made us select DXD rather than only 192 kilohertz to operate, or 176 kilohertz, sorry, to operate DSD signals without harming those transients too much. Of course, back then and still today, there's probably some DSD purists and aficionados that would tell what you're doing is mess up our 1-bit purity of original of world, but that's the price to pay to make something work sometimes. Let's see, that could be interesting now, because I just happen to be among the guys who make it all happen here. So you can listen to it as well. Although here, probably with the HDMI output, you can't hear the original files as they were recorded. I've here a spectrogram of what my friends from Pro Studio Masters and from McGill recorded last year in an ambitious program to record simultaneously various genres of music in PCM and in DSD, running all the sampling rates possible. I think they did 11 recordings parallel, plus they recorded on tape recorders as well at the same time. So very ambitious challenge. And here we can listen an excerpt from Smetana's Vltava, the Moldau, interpreted by the fine McGill Symphony Orchestra. That's it. And you see that typical symphonic ensemble with easily transient that go all the way up to 100 kilohertz on the spectrograph. This is another example of the same file, not the same file, the same recording, but with a different sampling rate. Guess which one could be which one. And here we're moving past, I think I have a little bit of time left, to another decade. And it's the final part of my presentation tonight. So, we're having different solutions, and we worked to leave as little room for criticism on being as loyal and transparent to the original analog world, be it either with high sampling rate PCM or with DSD. And we constantly measure all these equipments. We have audio precisions here and there. We check all that, and we still hear people coming to us, and these are people who we tend to believe have a stunning ear and great listening qualities. And they tell us, oh, here we hear a difference between this implementation and this implementation. So there are still some mysteries for us as a manufacturers, which we cannot elucidate by simple measurements. So we have to trust on their ears to tell us what to do next and why things could still not be okay. And one of the recent piece of focus I've been looking at is, okay, would it be helpful to move beyond 24-bit? Would it be helpful to move higher than DXD 352.8 kilohertz? And I don't think that the problem is there any longer. I think we're fine with what we have in terms of time resolution and in terms of frequency resolution and amplitude resolution. But one of the intriguing things is about the regularity at which we take those samples in time. In short, it could be that we may find some clue there. You all know what jitter is about, just a little time displacements of the exact timings at which we take those snippets of the analog world into the digital domain. And we, of course, try to keep that jitter as low as possible, and if it's not, we can easily measure the defect on our equipment. However, we don't have an explanation for that yet, why some guys still are able to perceive subtle differences. And one of the things we are now interested in further investigating is what happens in the very low frequency domain of these time misalignments of sampling. What the telecom industry calls WANDA, which is defined as the jitter components under 10 Hertz. So very low moving variations in speed. And to our surprise, if we come back to our previous jitter curve, what you see here, this fuzziness about the precise timings where samplings are being taken, could explain why people still manage to hear something. It's a mystery, but our auditory system keeps on surprising us. What I came up, but I botched it up as a conjecture almost, is that the human consciousness is essentially a predictor. And all the synaptic activity in our brain, especially the one related to the auditory mechanism, is networked doing its best at anticipating what's coming next. And then any temporal degradation of those clues of the stimulus will result directly in a less accurate prediction. And if fatigue of being wrong diminishes our pleasure of listening to music, then we should definitely take a closer look at this hypothesis. And hence I would warmly welcome any of you with interest in this field to plan for a more academic study in upcoming projects. Meanwhile, and in the application of the principle of precaution, we decided to select components with far better specs in the WANDA and lower range of jitter components in our recent products. And you can see here typically what we have now selected for new equipment, Anubis being one of them, is an ultra-low phase noise oscillator whose green curve is about 20 dB lower in phase noise as ordinary crystal oscillators, which you can see blue curve of up there. And this could also be in agreement with the psychoacoustic studies made by Zwicker and Fastel last century, where the most sensitive frequency at which we perceive a modulation, AM or FM modulation, is around 4 Hertz. What I find puzzling is that the human brain was somewhat insensitive to similar modulation noise, despite being orders of magnitude worse in analog tape recorders or vinyl disc players. This is one of the worst digital audio equipment I've seen on the internet. And despite of that, you see the first modulation side lobes start around minus 80 dB. If we compare to what we managed to do back in the old times in analog tape recorders, we were 20 dB higher, and we were happy to be around minus 60 dB with our early side slope. So you see the background noise below, that's of course considerably better in digital, but the modulation noise is also an important factor. And despite of that, everybody says vinyl was the best we had, or tape was the best we have. So there's something intriguing here. But we're here on Earth to try our best to perfect the technology in one way or another. I was very privileged to help Stefan Kudelski in the late 80s when he was designing the T-audio dual capstan transport mechanism, to work with him on trying to work to reduce this modulation noise in one of the ways that he found was achieving great results, which was actually having a dual capstan transport mechanism with, I'm not sure if you see it, there was a special head, a tape tension sensor, just to the left of the middle one, which was the timecode recording head. So just to the left, you see a tape tensor, and this would servo the tape tension, speed, everything to behave as cleanly as possible while moving in front of the heads. That was the swan song of analog technology, probably. And we are here now, 30 years later, trying to do the same with crystals and other piece of equipment. So this actually worked quite well to reduce the modulation noise of tape. I think we're about there. Not bad. Just a little bit too long. Conclusions. Okay. That's definitely something that we should always remember. It's amazing how often I see people having expensive tools and devices, and the more plugins we have, etc., and they forget to use their human. In 2 seconds, the brain can decide what the problem may be, much faster than any analysis equipment. We've seen that depending on your choices of sampling rate, performance aesthetics can be affected. I think I didn't have to convince you that there is plenty of useful data above 20 kilohertz. At least the guys in archiving keep on repeating that to us. And they can even recover magnetic tape bias frequency to correct today the wow and flutter of non-spinning well capstan back then, just by analyzing the bias, which is about 150 or 160 kilohertz, the plangent process. Alias filters should be as far away from signals as possible. And in short, consider using 192 kilohertz as a minimum and the DSD 384 kilohertz as a preferred sampling rate. Sounds like an advertisement, but sorry for that. I finish with another one. Nothing beats the live experience, and make sure you get out and enjoy as often as possible the real thing at concerts. Thank you very much.